Queensland has pyramids, not metaphors, not tourist traps with a catchy name. Actual stone structures aligned to celestial events, carved with symbols nobody has successfully translated, sitting in the middle of cane fields and cattle country and coastal headlands where they have absolutely no business being. The mainstream explanation for most of them is either silence or embarrassment. Official bodies have not rushed to investigate. University archaeology departments have been notably reluctant to commit research funding. A handful of independent researchers have spent decades documenting these sites and been largely ignored for their trouble. What you are about to hear is not fringe conspiracy content. These are physical structures that exist in real locations across Queensland. They can be visited, measured, photographed, and argued about. What they cannot be, despite significant effort from people with professional reputations to protect, is explained. 13 of them. Starting now. Number 1. The Gympie Pyramid. About an hour and a half north of Brisbane, on the outskirts of a town better known for its country music festival and timber history, there is a terraced hillside that has caused more academic discomfort than almost anything else in Queensland's recorded history. The structure sits on private rural land near Gympie and consists of stone terraces rising in stepped formation up the side of a hill. When it was first brought to wider attention by amateur historian Doris Curtis in the 1970s, she argued it bore striking resemblance to ancient step pyramids found in Egypt, Mesoamerica, and Southeast Asia. The response from the mainstream was dismissal rather than investigation. The official position is that the terracing represents colonial-era farming modifications or natural geological formation. The problem with both explanations is that no comparable terracing exists on any neighbouring hillside. Colonial farming records make no reference to a terracing project of this scale, and the geological formations in the area do not produce tiered horizontal stonework of this regularity anywhere else. Several of the stone courses show evidence of cut and shaped facing stones rather than natural rock placement. If the terracing is natural, the shaped stone faces need their own explanation. That explanation has not been provided. Japanese researchers visited the site in the 1990s and identified structural similarities to ancient terraced sites in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Their findings were published in a Japanese academic journal and received minimal coverage in Australian media. What is not contested is that the terracing exists, that it covers a substantial area of hillside, and that no one who has physically examined the site has produced an explanation that accounts for all its features without leaving significant questions unanswered. Number 2. The Herberton stone arrangements. The Atherton tablelands in far north Queensland are a place where the conventional historical timeline of Australia already gets complicated. Stone arrangements documented in the highlands west of Cairns include formations of carefully placed rocks in geometric configurations that go well beyond anything that could plausibly be attributed to random placement or natural processes. Near the old mining town of Herberton, there are stone alignments that run for distances of up to several hundred meters. Some follow compass directions with a precision that has puzzled every surveyor who has measured them. Others appear to mark specific astronomical sight lines, including solstice and equinox sunrise positions. What makes the Herberton examples notable is their scale and the regularity of the stone placement, which involves rocks that in some cases weigh hundreds of kilograms and show evidence of having been moved significant distances from their natural geological source. Moving stones of that size across highland terrain requires planning, coordination, and purpose. None of those things happen by accident. What researchers working alongside communities have documented is that oral traditions reference these sites as ancient beyond any timeline that Western historical frameworks have been willing to accommodate. The archaeoastronomical evidence remains unpublished in mainstream journals, Not because the measurements are disputed, but because the implications of accurate astronomical alignment in pre-colonial Australian structures represent a significant challenge to establish narratives about the technological capacity of ancient communities on this continent. Number 3. The Bowen Basin Stone Circles. Central Queensland's coal country is not the first place most people would look for ancient mystery. But across the Bowen Basin, stretching through Emerald, Claremont, and the surrounding cattle and mining country, ground surveys have documented stone circles of varying sizes that do not correspond to any known purpose in the historical record. Some of these circles are small and could theoretically be explained as the remnants of temporary shelters or fire management structures. But a subset of them are considerably larger, some exceeding 20 meters in diameter, constructed from stones that have been selected, shaped in some cases, and placed with a consistency that implies intent beyond functional utility. The land has been heavily disturbed by farming, mining, and pastoral activity over a century and a half of European use. Many sites that researchers documented in the 1970s and 1980s no longer exist in their original form. Others have been partially destroyed and partially preserved by accident, depending on where property boundaries happen to fall. What the surveys that do exist show is that these formations are broadly distributed across the basin rather than concentrated in one location. That distribution pattern suggests they are not isolated curiosities, but the remnants of something more systematic, a tradition of construction that operated across a large geographic area over an extended period. Whatever produced these circles was operating at scale. No formal excavation of any Bowen Basin stone circle has ever been funded by state or federal archaeological bodies. Number 4. The Carnarvon Gorge carvings. Carnarvon Gorge, in the Carnarvon National Park of central Queensland, is one of the most significant rock art sites on the Australian continent. Where agreement ends is in the specific character of certain carvings that do not comfortably fit within the established typology of Australian rock art traditions. The art gallery, as the main decorated overhang is known, contains stencils, engravings, and paintings that represent thousands of years of human activity. Within that body of work, researchers have identified specific geometric engravings that bear formal similarities to symbols found in contexts separated from Queensland by tens of thousands of kilometres. Meander patterns that appear in decorative traditions across multiple ancient cultures. Nested arc symbols connected to a global pattern of motifs appearing in geographically isolated ancient communities. And in one section of the gorge, a series of what several independent researchers have described as script-like linear engravings that do not match any documented symbol system in the Australian rock art record. These markings have been examined by researchers who work professionally with ancient writing systems. None of them have produced a definitive identification, but more than one has stated publicly that the markings are too systematic and too regular to be dismissed as abstract decoration. Much of what researchers outside the management structure know about these features comes from photography rather than direct examination. That is a significant limitation when the question being asked requires close physical analysis of surface texture and tool marks. Number 5. The standing stones of the Darling Downs. The Darling Downs, the broad agricultural plain stretching west of the Great Dividing Range through Toowoomba and the Granite Belt, is not somewhere most Queenslanders associate with standing stone monuments. But across multiple properties in the region, farmers and station managers have documented standing stones and small clusters of uprights that appear to have been deliberately placed and oriented towards specific horizon points. The detail that makes them interesting is not their size. It is the consistency of their orientation across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, and the fact that several of them mark the same astronomical events when viewed from ground level at the appropriate time of year. A researcher documenting standing stones across the Downs in the 1990s found that 7 independent sites within a region of approximately 4,000 square kilometers were oriented to within a few degrees of the same sunrise position. The probability of that occurring by chance approaches statistical impossibility. That finding emerged from years of careful measurement across properties whose owners were often surprised to learn their paddock stones had any significance at all. That research was submitted to an Australian archaeological journal and rejected. The rejection letter did not identify what additional evidence would be sufficient, nor offer any counter-explanation for the orientation data that had been gathered. Number 6. The North Stradbroke Island formations. North Stradbroke Island, known as Minjerribah to its Quandamooka custodians, sits in Moreton Bay just east of Brisbane. What is considerably less well known is that the island contains stone formations in its interior that have resisted comfortable explanation for decades. The island's geology is predominantly sand. Sand islands do not naturally produce organized stone formations. The stones present in these formations are not native to Stradbroke's own geology, which means they were brought to the island. You cannot argue geological accident when the geology of the island cannot produce the stones being argued about. The formations include a concentration of shaped and placed rocks near the interior of the island that several researchers have described as representing a deliberate geometric arrangement. At least 2 independent investigators have measured the formation and documented a specific alignment that corresponds to a significant astronomical event. The Quandamooka community has at various points engaged with researchers and at other points declined to do so, which is their right entirely. Number 7. The Bald Rock Creek engravings. In southern Queensland, not far from the New South Wales border, Bald Rock Creek runs through country where the granite outcrops have been worked over by human hands across a time period that nobody has confidently mapped. A specific group of engravings on one outcrop surface has drawn repeated attention from researchers who specialize in ancient symbol systems. These particular engravings include what appear to be directional symbols, counting marks, and geometric forms arranged in rows and columns rather than in the scattered distribution typical of decorative or ceremonial rock art. The arrangement has prompted comparison with early administrative or recording systems from the ancient Near East, not because of direct resemblance to any specific script, but because of the structural logic of organized rows and regular repetition. Structure implies intent. Intent implies a purpose. The purpose here has not been identified. The site has been documented photographically and through tracings by at least 3 independent researchers over the past 40 years. None of them have published findings that would withstand peer review, partly because their findings require explanations that would overturn too much of the accepted historical record to be seriously considered within current academic frameworks. Number 8. The Temple of Boom, Fraser Island. Fraser Island, the world's largest sand island, contains within its dense interior rainforest a stone structure that has been variously described, variously dismissed, and variously rediscovered by different researchers over the past 50 years. The structure known informally as the Temple of Boom consists of worked stone in a forested interior setting. Granite boulders, some of them substantial, in configurations that include what at least 2 researchers have described as worked faces and deliberate stacking. Fraser Island's geology does not include granite. The rock has no natural origin on the island. The explanation most commonly offered is that the stones were carried as ship ballast and abandoned. The problem with this explanation is the inland location and the configuration of the stones, which does not resemble the random dumping of ballast material. Ballast gets dropped at a shoreline. It does not get arranged in a forested interior with worked faces presented outward. Nobody has formally excavated this site or formally addressed the question of the stone's origin with the depth of investigation the question deserves. Number 9. The Undara lava tubes markings. The Undara Volcanic National Park in North Queensland contains one of the world's longest lava tube systems, formed by an eruption approximately 190,000 years ago. Certain sections of the tube system contain markings on the basalt walls that do not correspond to natural geological processes and have not been satisfactorily attributed to any known tradition of human activity in the region. The specific markings that have drawn the most attention include a series of regular incisions on a basalt face. Regular incisions on basalt require a tool harder than the basalt itself. The placement of the markings at a location that requires deliberate navigation of the tube system to reach implies purposeful intent. Some of these markings are in sections where independent access would be extremely difficult and where surface weathering suggests significant age. A proper investigation would require direct sampling and laboratory analysis. That investigation has not been conducted. The anomalous markings in less visited sections of the system have received limited investigation from anyone with the tools to answer the most basic questions about them. Number 10. The Cooktown Stone Platform, north of Cairns, where the Cape York Peninsula begins its long reach toward Torres Strait, on a headland overlooking the Endeavour River estuary and the open sea beyond, there is a stone platform of considerable size. Not a natural shelf of rock, but a constructed surface, level and deliberate, with worked stone edges visible on its seaward face. The platform commands a view of the ocean approaches that would have been strategically significant to anyone monitoring maritime traffic. The mainstream historical narrative of Cooktown begins with Cook. The stone platform does not fit comfortably into that beginning. Its construction implies a community with the organizational capacity and motivation to invest significant labor in a permanent structure at a prominent coastal location. The questions of who built it and when have not been seriously pursued by institutions with the resources to answer them. Local Gugu Yimithir knowledge holders have their own understanding of the headland, sharing some of that knowledge with researchers and holding other parts close, as is appropriate. Number 11. The Glasshouse Mountains Chambers. The Glasshouse Mountains rise abruptly from the flat coastal plain north of Brisbane, volcanic necks and plugs that have dominated the skyline of the Sunshine Coast hinterland for as long as humans have been looking at them. Several of these volcanic formations contain chambers that show evidence of deliberate modification. These are alcoves and recesses in the rock faces where the stone has been worked, in some cases smoothed, and in at least 2 documented instances shaped into forms that go beyond any obvious functional purpose. Finding worked stone inside a volcanic formation that tourism operators walk visitors past every weekend is the kind of detail that tends to get quietly set aside rather than prominently advertised. The more challenging question is when these chambers were first modified and whether the form of the working matches what we know about the tools and techniques available to the communities documented in the historical record for this region. The Glasshouse Mountains have Jinibara and Kabi Kabi cultural significance, and traditional knowledge of the mountains includes information about their use that extends well beyond the geological tourism narrative. Number 12. The Cloncurry Stone Walls. 800 kilometres inland from Townsville, in the dry heat of the Queensland outback, there are stone walls in the country around Cloncurry that have no obvious explanation, not the remnants of colonial pastoral infrastructure. Walls built from rough sandstone and quartzite, running for distances that make no practical pastoral sense, in configurations that have prompted researchers to use words like defensive and boundary marking. The walls predate European settlement. The pastoral records of early station runs in the region contain no reference to the construction of stone walls of this character. The building material in many sections comes from sources not immediately adjacent to where the walls now stand, implying a degree of planning and material transport that goes beyond informal, opportunistic construction. The Cloncurry region does not carry the same density of archaeological attention that the coast and the ranges receive. Resources follow tourism, and Cloncurry's archaeological case has never had a tourism industry to generate funding for investigation. That absence of funding is not evidence that nothing is there. It is evidence that the system for deciding what gets investigated has its own priorities. A mineral explorer documenting the area in the 1980s photographed and measured a section of wall that ran for approximately 4 kilometers with only minor interruptions. The documentation sat in a private collection for years before a copy reached researchers who knew enough to understand what they were looking at. Number 13. The Magnetic Island Rock Art Complex. Magnetic Island sits in Cleveland Bay, 8 kilometers from Townsville. The Rock Art Complex in the National Park interior is the largest concentration of ancient marking on the island. Within that broader complex, researchers working in the 1990s and 2000s identified a specific group of engravings that presented significant interpretive challenges. These engravings include concentric forms, directional markings, and what at least one researcher with a background in ancient Mediterranean symbol systems described as bearing formal resemblance to Phoenician navigational notation. That claim attracted significant criticism, partly on the merits of the comparison and partly on the basis that accepting it would require accepting a version of pre-colonial Australian history that the discipline was not prepared to entertain. The honest assessment is that the researchers' specific identification may have overreached the available evidence. What the criticism did not adequately address was the underlying question of why that specific group of engravings was structurally different from the other rock art at the same site. Dismissing an answer is not the same as providing a better one. That distinction matters when the physical evidence is still sitting on the rock face waiting for someone to take it seriously. 13 structures, 13 locations spread across a state the size of Western Europe. Stone that was carried, placed, shaped, and aligned. Walls running through outback heat. Engravings in gorge walls and lava tubes and forested island interiors. Terraced hillsides in farming country. Chambers worked into volcanic rock. The pattern that runs through all of them is the same. Physical evidence that exists. Conventional explanations that fall short. And an official response that has consistently preferred silence to investigation. That preference for silence is not random. Seriously investigating these sites risks producing findings that are inconvenient for a historical narrative that places Aboriginal Australians in a particular relationship with time, technology, and connection to the wider ancient world. Findings that challenge that narrative do not disappear just because the institutions with the resources to investigate them choose to look elsewhere. They stay in the landscape, weathering slowly, waiting. The people who have spent their own time documenting these sites are not primarily conspiracy theorists. They are people who found something that did not fit, who tried to report it through appropriate channels, and who were turned away often enough to conclude that the channels themselves were the problem. What Queensland contains in its landscape is an unresolved conversation between physical evidence and official narrative. That conversation has been waiting for the right questions for a long time. The structures are still there. The questions still have no satisfying answers. If any of these 13 sites caught your attention, drop a comment below with which one and why. Subscribe if you want to be there when the next one comes out. It is already in progress.